Welcome to eMentor's webinar series with your host, Ann Tropea, Program Manager at eMentor. This is a recording of our live webinar. After you've finished watching, please head over to our website, www.ementorprogram.org, to see the lineup for future webinars and to learn more about the eMentor program. And now let's get started. So welcome everyone to our latest webinar. This one is called How to Interview Like a Boss, and I will be hosting. I'm Ann Tropea, the Program Manager for eMentor. I am also a longtime resume writer and career coach and guide. I have helped clients over many years increase their interviewing skills, become more comfortable with interviewing, and I'm hoping to be able to share some of that knowledge with you all today. I wanted to start with a poll, so I'm just going to launch that now. And I want to give everyone a few minutes to answer, because I think it will be valuable to know kind of where everyone's pain points are when it comes to interviewing, and where I can focus some of the information that I'm sharing so that I make sure all of you attending live get a chance to have some of your particular issues and questions addressed. So I'll just give everyone a couple of minutes to answer a quick poll. And if you could give me a thumbs up in the chat, if you can see that, that would be great. Just want to make sure that everyone can see the poll and access that. I'll just run through this really quick before we start, so we can everyone can see kind of what we're going to be covering. It looks like about half of you are unsure about the interviewing process because you just have a lack of practice. That's, most of us don't interview for a living. So lack of practice is definitely something we can talk through and figure out how to be more comfortable with that process. A close second is talking about yourself. That's always, no one loves to do that. Well, very few people like to do that. And then unsure about how to answer questions as well. All right, least favorite interview question. We are definitely going to cover this, but let's see what everyone here has to say. What is your biggest weakness? Yeah, that is a hard one to answer, and we'll talk through some strategies a little bit later. Where do you see yourself in 5 years? Half of you answered yes to that question. It's a terrible question to ask, but there are definitely ways to get around that or kind of refocus that question so that it benefits you during the interview. And then, of course, tell me a little bit about yourself. We can also talk through some strategies about essentially your 30-second elevator speech is what I like to call that. And finally, what does everyone hope to gain from this webinar today? More confidence, insight into the process, and tips for the virtual interview. Perfect. So I'll just share these results really quick so we can see kind of what everyone responded. And I will let you know that we will cover all of these questions and all of these concerns throughout the webinar. So just a quick reminder, if you have a question during this webinar, please feel free to just put it in the chat. And if it's a good stopping point, I'll kind of stop and address the question at that time. Otherwise, we can wait until the end and kind of do get all of our questions out and answered at the end of the webinar. So again, my name is Ann Tropea. Welcome to How to Interview Like a Boss. Let's go ahead and just jump into this first slide. Hopefully. Well, now. Oops. Okay, there we go. I promise this is not my first time at the rodeo. Interviewing fundamentals. So this webinar is really going to focus on some of our basics of interviewing. And I am going to focus on the virtual interview environment because that has become kind of ubiquitous for a lot of companies. However, if you are interviewing in person, this will still be relevant to an in-person interview as well. But there are kind of a few tricks to the virtual environment. And because it's so common now, I would like to kind of walk through some of that with you. So the first portion of our conversation will be about setting the stage. How do we navigate the virtual interview environment and build rapport with our interviewer or interviewers? Next, we'll talk about questions and answers, what to expect, what to ask, and how to answer. And finally, we're going to talk about how do we control the narrative of the interview and kind of talk through some strategic ways to direct the conversation and take control of the interview. So I wanted to take a moment to kind of talk a minute about language and culture. And depending on who you're interviewing with, who your interviewers are, maybe you're interviewing with one person, maybe you have a panel interview where maybe 3 or 4 or even more people are asking you questions. It's important to note that, you know, we all come from different cultures, different communities, different backgrounds. Some of us speak multiple languages. Some of us may not have English as a primary language or as a native language. It's important to keep that in mind. So if you are interviewing, kind of keep that in the back of your mind, because the people who are interviewing you may come from a different background, may come from a different culture, may have other languages and kind of different ways of communicating. So it's important to keep that, you know, maybe not forefront in your mind, but just remember that we're all coming from a different space, and that may impact kind of the way that you decide to communicate and how you decide to conduct the interview. A good way to figure that out ahead of time so that you're not kind of flying blind in the interview process is to just go ahead and ask whoever is setting up the interview for you. It is a good idea to maybe send them a quick email in response and say, hey, Mr. or Ms. So-and-so, thanks so much for confirming my interview time. Can you tell me a little bit about who I'll be speaking with on, whatever day the interview is? That will give you a chance to figure out, one, are you going to be interviewing with one person or more than one person, which is always good to know. I would not like to show up at an interview and realize the day of that I was going to be interviewing with a panel of 6 people virtually. I would definitely want to know that ahead of time and at least be able to mentally prepare myself for that process. The other kind of benefit to knowing who you're going to be speaking with ahead of time is that you have a chance to, what I like to say benignly as a little bit of internet stalking. So you'll want to look up those people either on the company website, on LinkedIn, and take some time to figure out who those people are. Learn about them, read their biographies if they're available. See, where did they go to school? Where do they live? Where are they located? Kind of what is the history of their career trajectory? All of that information might seem extraneous, but that is good information for you to be able to have a background in the people who you'll be speaking with, so that you can really tailor your message. And we'll be talking a little bit more about the importance of remembering who your audience is and making sure that you're speaking to that audience and not, not kind of just giving answers in a vacuum. So the first topic I really wanted to cover is what I call setting the stage for the virtual interview. We have to worry a little bit more about kind of technology ahead of time if we're going to be interviewing over Zoom or Teams or some other virtual platform. You want to make sure that you kind of turn yourself into a filmmaker for the day and set up your lighting, set up your location, make sure you feel comfortable with your background. So I don't, if everyone can see, I am sitting in my dining room. This is kind of where I do all of my work. I don't have a traditional office, but you'll always notice that I'll I'll kind of have my personal background in the background instead of kind of a Zoom background or something else. That's my comfort level, and I feel like that shares a little bit about my personality and kind of makes it less formal. You all need to decide what you feel comfortable with and whether or not you want to set up a virtual background, kind of blur your background. If you are using Zoom as a platform, there are all kinds of options and settings that you can mess around with. And definitely you don't want to be doing that the day of your interview. That's something you want to have set up and ready to go prior to. Lighting is important as well. You'll notice that I have a window behind me, but I do have the curtains drawn and I'm using some professional lighting. So if you want to go out and buy a ring light or any kind of other kind of webinar or virtual program type of lighting, you can do that. There are lots of resources out there, especially for social media influencers who are kind of doing a lot of video content. But if you're not, make sure you're lit well, either with a desk lamp or some other kind of lighting, and that you're not backlit. In other words, you don't have a strong lighting source coming in from behind you, because that will kind of cast you in shadow, and no one wants to look like they're interviewing for the next hacker position at some tech company. So that's kind of the basics of setting up your virtual environment, and it's absolutely essential that you run through a tech check prior to. You can restart a Zoom meeting with yourself. Just make sure your lighting looks good, you're comfortable with how you're showing up on camera, and that all of your sound is taken care of. The next, and let me just back up. If you're not in a virtual interview, you have a lot less to worry about, right? You don't need to worry about your lighting or your camera or kind of any of that other movie making stuff. But you do need to, prepare ahead of time. Definitely make sure you have everything with you that you need, and that you're in clothing that is comfortable for you. If you're wearing new shoes or kind of something that maybe is like outside of your comfort zone, that's going to come through in the interview. So you want to make sure you're comfortable, and that also goes back to the virtual environment. So setting the stage, important. That's how we set ourselves up for success. Building rapport is next on my list. And this is incredibly important. And it's kind of a trick for getting control of the interview right away. When we talked a little bit earlier about kind of stalking the people that we're going to be interviewing with, that's also a way for you to find some touch points that you can bring up in those first kind of awkward moments of any interview, where there's always going to be some small talk, some chit chat before your interviewers start diving into interview questions. If you can build rapport with your interviewers right away, you are already positioning yourself for them to be predisposed to like your answers, and they'll be pulling for you. So an example of this might be if you've done your homework and researched the people that you're going to be speaking with, you might say, oh, the person I'm interviewing with went to Loyola University. I also went to Loyola University. And you might just mention that and say, hey, I saw you, we've gone to the same school. How did you enjoy Chicago, which was the Loyola that I attended? Where did you live in Chicago? What's your favorite pizza place? I loved, my personal favorite was Giordano's, hands down. So if anyone wants to talk about that later, we definitely can. But building a rapport is important because it sets you up for success, and it also kind of breaks the ice. Second, it will show the interviewer that you have done your homework. You know who you're talking to, you know your audience. All right, finally, if you are interviewing virtually, you can really leverage that environment to help you in the interview. You can have documents up on your desktop, such as your resume. You can pull up the company website. You can pull up the LinkedIn profile of the person that you're speaking with. No one is going to be able to see that information if you're having a back and forth over Zoom, if you're not sharing your screen, right? So use those tools, use the opportunity of the virtual environment to have all of that information and all of your information kind of at your fingertips, so that you don't have to memorize your resume. You don't have to memorize the company website. If you need to refer to it, it's all right there for you during the interview, which can be invaluable as you're trying to answer some of these questions that can sometimes come at you pretty rapid fire. So definitely use the notes, use the documents. If you are in a physical in-person interview, I always recommend to clients that they go ahead and just bring a copy of their resume. It's okay to refer to that during an interview. And it's also okay and encouraged to take a notepad at least, so you can take some notes during the interview, so that you can refer back to those as needed. This may be more relevant if you're interviewing for more of a technical or info heavy kind of role where the questions are complicated, and you might want to take a quick note so that you can make sure that you're fully answering the questions that are asked. So definitely make sure that you take advantage of all the tools that are available, depending on whether you're in person or virtual in your interview. So questions and answers. This is everyone's favorite part. Just kidding. Definitely not everyone's favorite part. Let's talk through some questions that you are likely to hear and walk through some of the answers. And then we'll also talk through some questions for you to ask kind of at the end of the interview, where every interviewer is going to say, and do you have any questions for us? The answer should always be yes, and you should have some prepared, but we'll get to that in a minute. First of all, questions to expect. Number one, tell me a little bit about yourself. This is such a terrible question, but it is important that you have an answer prepared. It's very difficult to talk about yourself on the fly without rambling and taking 10 minutes to give your whole life story. When we get nervous, it can be very easy to just keep talking to fill space. But really what we want to focus on is making sure that we're giving succinct and direct answers to the questions. And so you'll see right in the middle of this slide, I have in bold, answer the question. That is rule number one of interviewing. Make sure you answer the question that's being asked and not the question that you think is being asked or that you think that they want to hear. If you're not sure about the question, if it's unclear, if it's confusing, please don't try to guess at what the interviewer is asking you. It's much better to ask for clarification so that you fully understand the question and what the interviewer is looking for, so that you can make sure and address that directly with relevant examples and information. So, tell me about yourself is an opportunity for you to kind of set the stage of your personal narrative. I would focus on writing out ahead of time, write out maybe a 3 to 4 sentence overview of who you are professionally. When you do that, you'll be able to kind of have time to think about it. What are the things you want to get across right away? What are the things you want your interviewer to know before they even, this is usually the first question they ask, by the way. So this is an opportunity for you to, again, set the stage and build rapport. So take some time before your interview to work on that elevator speech. Again, 3 to 4 sentences is all that you need to focus on. You might talk, depending on where you are in your career, you might talk about your education, your professional training. You might talk about a recent role. You might give an overview of your career and kind of where you've been and where you're headed. It depends on, it's very dependent on you as an individual. But I think the takeaway here is to really, really focus on having that prepared ahead of time and practicing it with somebody else so that you get the chance to talk through that question a few times. I promise that if you have even done, 10 or 15 minutes of practice with this particular question, you'll feel much more confident about answering it in real time. Okay. What are your greatest strengths? And kind of the other half of that question is, what are your greatest weaknesses? These are tricky. It is tempting to, especially when we're talking about weaknesses, it is tempting to give a weakness that is not really a weakness. For example, saying something like, well, my greatest weakness is that I really just work too hard in my role, and I spend too many hours at work. That's not really a weakness, right? It's almost like a strength couched in a strange way. So my suggestion is always to give a weakness that is actually a weakness, but one that you have addressed in you've already addressed previously and have kind of developed a fix for. So an example might be, my greatest weakness is that I sometimes overcommit myself. I tend to overcommit myself and take on too many projects that I don't really have the bandwidth for. However, I've taken steps to mitigate that by creating a calendar for myself of all of my projects and learning and effectively being able to say, no, I don't have time for that right now, but here's when I can get it. Here's when I can get that project started or get that project completed for you. So that's a good example of, how do you give a weakness that's a weakness without it seeming like there's something wrong with you as a candidate. Like, we all have weaknesses, and it shows that you've, again, thought about this ahead of time. You've done some self-reflecting, and you have taken steps to kind of change the things that maybe you're not as good at. When you're talking about greatest strengths, You want to focus on a strength that is directly relevant to the job that you're applying for or the job that you're interviewing with. So if you are interviewing for kind of a tech sales position, you might want to focus on your ability to connect with potential clients and create good relationships that will increase your sales pipeline. You wouldn't want to focus on something that really wasn't relevant to that particular role, like maybe your ability to, write a funny blog post for social media, just as a silly example. So definitely make sure your strength is related to the job that you're interviewing for. Again, another opportunity to just put your skills front and center for the employer. And finally, describe a situation when you, and this could take many forms, such as, describe a situation where you had to make a decision without the benefit of being able to talk to a supervisor first. Describe a situation when you disagreed with, the decision of your teammates and had to advocate for a different course of action. These can be tricky to answer on the fly. Expect that you may get this question and kind of come up with a list of answers that might fit in with that type of question. And this is a good idea to do anyway before you interview, to come up with a list of kind of your top 10 or maybe even your top 5 kind of pieces of information about you, about your skills, about your work history that you absolutely want your interviewer to know about. Okay. You can then, if you have that list in front of you and you've thought it through ahead of time, your goal will be to try to work in that information where it fits within the conversation naturally. Okay. So if you have a list of things that you want to get across, you can pull from that list for some of these questions to expect. And we'll talk a little bit more about the benefit of creating that, your top 5 or your top 10 list in just a minute. But before we get to that, let's talk about quickly questions to ask. So usually, and I've sat through many interviews and I've interviewed many people myself, and I always ask this question at the end: do you have any questions for us? Okay. You need to have some questions to ask. And again, this goes back to the research that you've done even before the interview has started, so that you know inside and out what this company does, what their mission is, what their goals are, so that you can come up with questions in advance to ask the interviewer. Number 1, it makes it look like you've done your homework. Again, it shows that you're enthusiastic, that you know how to research, you know how to prepare and take initiative. Second, it will give you insight into the types of things that you might want to know. Remember, an interview is also a chance for you to figure out if this is a place you want to work. Use this opportunity to ask questions that you actually want to know the answer to. The only caveat I will offer is that I would not ask about salary at an initial stage interview. That is something that is typically negotiated after an offer is made. So that's not a question I would ask. I would also not ask about things like vacation policies or parental leave policies. It sends the wrong message. And that is always something that you can easily find out once you already have an offer in hand. Questions to ask should focus on things that you actually want to know about the company to figure out if you want to be there. You can do that in a couple of ways. I like asking, what would my first 60 days look like? What are some what are some milestones, some goals that you have for this position? Who would my teammates be? What kind of projects would I be working on? What does my day-to-day look like? So all of these questions will give you a lot of good information, but they also show that you're, again, enthusiastic about the role, that you want to be there interviewing, and that you've taken some time to think about the company itself. Second question, another good example. What do you love about working here, and what would you change? So that's a good question for someone who maybe it would be, if you're interviewing with someone who would be your direct supervisor, this would be a really good question to ask, because then you'll get some true insight into that company culture. If you're interviewing kind of with an HR rep at a more preliminary level, you may still get some interesting information. You'll just have to see, who, again, know your audience. Who are you interviewing with? Who are you talking to? What is the goal of your question? Every question that you ask, you should have an ulterior motive for yourself and understand what kind of information you're trying to elicit from that question. So you'll usually only have time for a couple of questions. Make those count. Another good one that you can ask if you're kind of stuck and you're not sure, asking about professional development opportunities within the company or within the role. Well, you may want to know the answer to that question, but you'll also find out, is professional development something that this company prioritizes? And that might make a difference to you depending on where you are in your career. And it also might make a difference if you are looking to move up within a company quickly. This will give you some insight into whether they have a formal process for kind of helping build skills within the company itself. So when we're talking about interviewing, one of the things you want to try to do is control the narrative of the interview and be able to tell your unique story during that process. You can reframe questions that are asked of you, right? You can answer, again, you always want to answer the question, but how you answer the question is up to you. So when we talked a little earlier about making a list of kind of all your top 5 or your top 10 kind of bits of information that you absolutely want your interviewer to know, this is part of where that comes in. You want to make sure that as you're answering questions, you're working that information in. The way that you answer the question is going to determine how follow-up questions are asked most of the time. The only time that's not true is if maybe you're interviewing for kind of federal employment, where interview questions are super structured and the interviewers generally do not deviate because they have kind of a strict hiring rubric and everyone has to answer the same questions. Aside from that, almost every other role will, in almost every other role in the private sector, for a startup, for a nonprofit, anything like that, usually if you've developed rapport with your interviewers and you're having a good back and forth conversation, usually people have follow-up questions if you're giving answers that are interesting and relevant to the role that you're interviewing for. So you have the opportunity to change the course of the interview depending on the types of answers that you're giving. If you really want an employer to know, for example, that you have, maybe you have some kind of specialized software experience, or maybe you have technical training in kind of programming languages that maybe it's on your resume, but it's not as called out as it could be, or it's on there and it's prominent, but you want to make sure that your interviewer really is aware of kind of that particular skill set. Find a way to weave that information in. That could come up right away in the tell me about yourself question, right? It could come up in an answer to what are your greatest strengths. And it might come up in an answer to a question that your interview is asking you specifically about that role once they get past kind of those more general questions. So again, be prepared, right? Have that list ready to go and know exactly the information you want to get across, because again, this is your interview. It's your opportunity to shine. It's your opportunity to tell your story. And remember that the person interviewing you may also be nervous. They may not be as prepared as they would like. And so you can have some leadership and some ownership in that process and realize that it truly is a back and forth. So again, interviewing is not something that we might enjoy doing, but it is a path forward. And we need to remember that we have the power to control that path to a certain extent. So I just want everyone to remember that it's important to think about your interview as an opportunity for you to have a conversation with people that you may very well be working with. And it's a way for you to really get to know the company and also get across all the information that you want to get across. Interviews should be conversational. Unless you're having a very formal interview with the FBI or some kind of federal role where it's super structured and kind of an informal conversation wouldn't be appropriate. Again, know your audience, right? But for most people, thinking about an interview as a back and forth conversation can be really helpful, both to make you feel more comfortable in the interview environment, and also to just facilitate information flow both ways. So an interview is not an interrogation. You're not in a courtroom. You're not sitting on a witness stand. You can ask questions. You can give information if you feel comfortable, telling a joke. Do that. I tend to use humor myself, and that's kind of my go-to. If that works for you, then great. As long as it's appropriate and professional. I think most people really appreciate kind of a more informal tone when they're having a conversation with somebody else, even though they are kind of seeing, are you the right fit for this role? You're also trying to figure out, well, are you the right fit company for my career path? And finally, again, if anything is unclear in the interview, if there's a question that's unclear, if you're not sure if you fully answered a question, ask for clarification, ask for something to be repeated, rephrased, say, I hope that answers your question. Is there anything else is there any other information I can provide? Did I fully answer your question? Engage with the person that you're talking to and really know that it's more comfortable for them as well to have that back and forth. And, again, I'm just going to hammer this home because it's super important. You really want to answer the question that's being asked. And it's always better to ask for clarification. If you just don't know the answer, if it's just outside your wheelhouse, the question makes no sense, even if you've asked for clarification and you're like, gosh, I don't have the answer for this. Instead of saying just, I don't know, or I can't answer, it's always better to say, something like, wow, I don't have the answer for that, but I would love the opportunity to follow up in an email. Or you could say, well, that I just don't, I've never dealt with that type of situation. I don't have that particular experience. However, here is how I might address that problem using kind of the knowledge and the skill sets that I have. So if you're really not sure about the answer, you can either try to build an answer and kind of talk through it out loud so that the interviewer gets the benefit of kind of getting some insight into your thought process and your problem solving abilities. Or if it's just, you can't answer it and you're not going to be able to come up with a quick on the fly answer, it's better to say or admit that, I don't know the answer to that, would love to follow up later in an email. So finally, interviewing is hard. It's not something we enjoy, most of us. But I want you to know that you can be successful in an interview. Think about all the things that we've talked about. I've given you all some good strategies for approaching the process, for preparing for the process, and figuring out how to really just build that relationship with your interviewer and have a good conversation and a good back and forth. And then finally, think about interviewing as an opportunity and not something that you dread. So it should be, try to have fun with it. If you're prepared, if you've kind of gone through all the steps that we've talked about, I think it'll really make a difference in your ability to just feel more comfortable in that moment and really be able to answer questions and just get a good conversation going. So I'm going to stop sharing. And I would encourage all of you, if anyone has any questions, either raise your hand or put it in the chat. And I would love to answer kind of any particular, even specific questions that any of you might have about either what we've talked about or other interview or career related questions. And for those of you who, maybe you don't have any questions at the moment, you can always feel free to email me directly. You can find my email on the website. I will also be sending out a recording of this webinar, hopefully within the next week, for anyone who's interested in watching it again, or maybe sharing it with a friend who couldn't attend. But I'm always happy to meet with any of you at any time to talk through some of this stuff, or even help you prepare for an interview if you have one coming up and you think that would be helpful. We do have a question or a comment. So the comment is, it's sometimes helpful to imagine you already have the job. Was it easy to find a place to park? Is the office a place you would like to work, etc.? The interview is as much for the applicant as it is for the employer. That's absolutely true. And I hope that all of you have kind of understood that that is part of the process of interviewing. Absolutely. It's a two-way street. It's a chance for you to learn about the company culture and the position and your teammates, your future teammates, as much as it is for the employer to learn about you and your skills. If you're already in the interview, you're qualified for the role. They're interested in you. It's your opportunity to show that employer that you would be a great fit, that you would be a good teammate, that you fit in with the culture of that company, and that it makes sense that they'd be missing out if they didn't hire you. Anyone else have a question? So Dee asks, how would the process differ for a college student with no previous work experience? That's a great question. The process is typically the same, right? So you're still going to go through the interview process. You may not have as much work experience to draw on, but you can remember all experience is valid experience, whether or not you've gotten paid to do it. So if you have volunteer work, that's relevant. If you have coursework, that's relevant. Maybe an internship, maybe something that you've done in your community, something that you've kind of had an interest in and worked on your own. I had a resume client a couple of months ago who was in school for engineering and was asking me a very similar question, like, look, I haven't really had a job. I'm still in school. I'm getting a degree in engineering. How do I interview? How do I talk about the work? How do I talk about this job that I've never held and I've never kind of had a real job outside of, like bartending or, any kind of part-time like retail stuff that you might do as a master's student or as a college student. But it turned out that he had done a bunch of graphic design work and kind of building and inventing art and kind of replica like armor and just building these amazing structures on his own, just as part of his own hobbies and interests. And that's something cool that you can talk about that shows that, you have interest outside of, maybe what your degree is, that you've, that you're creative, that you've built stuff and kind of engaged in kind of other industries. So, pull from all aspects of your life, even if you've never held a full-time job, there are other things that you've done that are going to be of interest. And trust me, if you're being interviewed as someone right out of college, your interviewer knows that this is probably your first full-time job. And so they're expecting that. So don't feel like you need to be able to talk about, 10 years worth of work experience. They know that you're not going to have that, but they will want to know that you've thought ahead of time about kind of the diversity of your experience that we all have, and you're able to communicate that and talk about that. So we have another question. How do I build a project to show my recruiter at an interview if I've applied for with no previous experience? So I guess it depends on what type. I'll ask, can you clarify that question? I'm not sure. Right, project management. Mm-hmm. You can, if there's a way that you can offer that type of experience on a volunteer basis to show, to give yourself a platform. Oh, I see. So if you've had no previous experience, you can talk about, you can talk about what you know, talk about the things that you've done. You can talk about your approach to project management if you've never actually done it. You can talk about what you've learned in your program, in your degree program, or your professional development program. You can, if it's relevant, you could build a website for yourself and kind of list some projects that you would like to work on. It really just, it depends what type of projects we're talking about, and how easy it is to kind of demonstrate that. But it's definitely okay to talk through your ideas and kind of your hopes for what you would like to do and how you would approach those projects. Does that answer your question? Perfect. Yeah, that's a tricky one. It's not always easy to talk about stuff that we haven't done yet, but I think it's certainly okay to talk about the things that we'd like to do, and maybe our approach or our internal thought process for how we might go about engaging in those new projects. Anyone else? We have a few more minutes. I do think the hardest part about interviewing is just getting over the hurdle of feeling super uncomfortable in that space. Not everyone likes to role play, but it can be very helpful to do some interview prep. A career coach would be ideal so that they can give you kind of professional feedback. But if you don't have that as a resource, or you're not really interested in working with a coach like that, even a friend who is, in a professional industry would be a good person to practice with. You want someone who's going to give you honest feedback. So make sure you choose a friend who maybe is a little more straightforward, and will tell you if your answer sucks or it doesn't make sense. You might not want to ask the friend who just thinks you're amazing and is going to tell you you're great no matter what your answers sound like. So practicing is definitely key when it comes to interviewing. All right. Well, if no one else has any other questions, we'll go ahead and end here. Again, my name is Ann Tropea, and I am the program manager at eMentor. You can reach out anytime. My email is tropea@ementorprogram.org. You can also, for those of you who are members of eMentor, you can also find me through your dashboard within the platform and message me there. So thank you everyone for coming. It's been really fun. Reach out anytime, and I hope to see you all at our next webinar. Take care.
Thanks again for watching. If you would like to be the first to know about upcoming events, or if you're interested in receiving individual mentoring support or offering your mentoring expertise, please consider joining the eMentor program. Find out more by visiting our website at www.ementorprogram.org or send an email to admin@ementorprogram.org. Finally, feel free to follow along with eMentor on social media. We hope to see you next time.